If you're a subscriber to the channel Tabletop Time, then you may already be aware of Jazzas' homebrew chapter, the Astra Primursa, or the Space Bears. I just love the idea myself, and once they made some conversion parts available through Puppets War, I knew that I wanted to give this chapter a go myself. Well, it's been a while since I last did a kill team conversion, so let's build an Astra Primursa kill team. I'll be giving this guide 4 dead animal bits out of 5. It features a good amount of sculpting and trimming across a small squad, but there is nothing overly strenuous here. So the Space Bears have this bulky, burly appearance, and so I thought that basing this kill team around the heavy intercessors would fit the theme perfectly. I began by removing the parts required to build 4 heavies from the box, which is the max kill team size for these guys, before trimming those parts of any sprue tabs and mold lines. My first step after cleaning up these components was to cut away the chest aquilers. I've done this many times before, so feel free to skip this part if you're already aware of my process. But for those of you who are not, I used my knife to remove some small chunks from the aquila until most of the symbol had been removed. From here, I then held my blade perpendicular to the chest and used a scraping motion. This removed any remaining lumps of plastic and left me with a smooth, featureless chest, which is perfect for adding extra details such as pouches and grenades to later on. After removing the aquila, I assembled the torso and the legs and repeated this whole process across the other 3 heavy intercessors until I was left with this, 4 torsos with bare chests. The first detail that I wanted to add to these Primursa were some loincloths, which I decided to sculpt. So I started out by cutting and mixing up some green stuff. However, instead of opting to go for a regular fabric here, I instead wanted to create some loin chainmail instead. I felt this would really help with the rugged and heavily armoured look of the intercessor, and to create this I opted to use one of the chainmail texture pads from Green Stuff World. I first added some Vaseline to the plate so that my green stuff wouldn't get stuck to it, and then pressed on my pre-mixed putty. I spread this out into a fine layer, using the handle of my paintbrush to help roll it out. I also used a little Vaseline here to also prevent the other side of the green stuff from sticking to the roller or my fingers. Once spread out, I carefully lifted the putty away from the surface, revealing the chainmail texture. I left this to partly cure for about an hour or so, just to prevent the chainmail detail from being damaged as I worked with it further. Once it had firmed up a bit, I cut out a rectangle with my scalpel and cut out a ragged edge at one of the shorter ends, making sure to use Vaseline across my tools to help prevent them sticking. The chainmail was then added to the waist of one of the torsos. I used just a small amount of pressure to blend the chainmail just beneath the belt. If you're having trouble with attaching this, you can always use a small blob of superglue to help you out. Once again, this was repeated across all 4 of the torsos. The final change that I intended to make to all 4 of the heavy intercessors was to remove the metal hoods and replace them with a fur collar later on. I used my saw to make a straight cut across the back, removing the extra piece of armor. This cut was then cleaned up with my scalpel and their backpacks were glued on. With the generic modifications to each of the torsos complete, I could begin working on the kill team members on an individual basis. I started out with Kenai, the heavy weapons expert of the team, and began with his heavy bolter. His bolter was a little too clean though, and didn't quite represent the rugged theme I was trying to convey. This would be resolved by first removing the ammo compartment from one of the bolter options. I used my saw to create a flat surface beneath the bolter that I could attach an orc belt to. This belt was sourced from the Flash Gits kit and just required a little trimming to the top to allow it to fit against the heavy bolter. Once everything was lining up nicely, I glued the bolter together before attaching this to one of the torsos. With the torso complete, I could glue on some of the custom Astra Primursa parts. To make use of that empty space on the chest, I decided to add an animal pelt. For this, I used another texture plate, but this time I used the fur texture rather than the chainmail. This was used in an identical manner to the chainmail. I added Vaseline to the plate, pressed on my green stuff, and then carefully peeled it away. This time around, I didn't leave it to cure, as I wanted to still be able to resculpt it later. After removal, I cut the piece to a shape and size that would fit nicely across Kenai's chest. This was then carefully positioned between the bolter and the chest. I'd flattened out some of the details during this process, so armed with a cocktail stick that had been dipped in Vaseline, I then scoured a few short wavy lines into the putty. I followed the same direction as the fur created by the plate, and after a few grooves had been added, I had repaired some of the squash bits and further blended the fur onto the armour. With Kenai complete, I could begin to work on my second team member, Sitka. While the Heavy Intercessor's available loadout is limited, I really wanted to use this clawed shield from the Primursa upgrade set, and so let the rule of cool win out over the rulebook. At first I thought that I could equip the shield in Sitka's left arm, and still have this heavy bolt rifle in his right, with the stock being braced against the shield, and so I went through the whole process of cleaning up the left hand from the bolter. Unfortunately, this wouldn't quite work out. My changes to the left arm did work, however. I started out with a regular bolt rifle carrying left arm and used my clippers to cut away the wrist. From here, I then cleaned up the cut so it would fit better against the shield's hand. It was at this stage that I realised that the braced bolter wouldn't quite work out. I did some dry fitting and found that the bolt rifle was being held too closely to the chest to realistically rest against the shield's edge. I still wanted to use the shield though, so continued to superglue this to the already cut left arm. The right arm would be replaced with a grenade throwing arm from the Heavy Intercessor set instead, which allowed me to pivot the theme of this model into a kind of grenadier. Once both of these arms were in place, I completed the main structure of the model by gluing on some Primursa bits, specifically the shoulder pads and one of the helmetless heads. From here, I could then sculpt on a fur collar. This was created by first rolling out some green stuff onto my texture plate in the same way I tackled the fur on Kenai. However, instead of spreading out the fur flat, I instead pinched it into a rough tube shape and placed this just behind the head, along the area that I cleared away the hood from. This was followed up with the cocktail stick, and I used it to both press the fur into its desired shape, whilst also restoring some of the fur texture that might have been lost. Sitka's Grenadier theme was then finished off with a few grenades. These were taken from the Reaver kit and were glued to the chest armour. I then moved on to Coda, the sergeant of the team. I wanted to make use of one of the Primursa power claws for this guy, even though it's not technically a viable weapon option for this unit in the game. I began with the Heavy Intercessor pointing arm and clipped away the hand just behind the wrist. Following a little trimming and flattening of the wrist to ensure a good fit, I glued the bear claw into place with a little superglue. This arm was then glued to the torso, but now I had the problem of what to do with the right arm. While the Heavy Intercessor kit does feature bolt rifles being held in just the right hand, they came with pre-sculpted shoulder pads. I could have trimmed them down, but I don't think that the Primursa pads would have fit properly against the bolt rifle. So instead of this, I opted to grab the pistol carrying arm from the Eradicator's kit. This kit also contains Gravis Armoured Space Marine, so the parts work nicely together. The pistol arm also features bionics, which gels really well with the grizzled sergeant aspect of the model. With the arms in place, I glued the shoulder pads and the head onto the model. Now that Coda's appendages had been added, I could see that he was looking a little top heavy. To remedy this, I decided to add a few items about the waist to help balance things out a little bit. I chose some skulls for this task, partly because it would add to the savage nature of the model, but mainly so I had an excuse to say dead animal bits. The skulls were taken from the Citadel skull set, but they wouldn't quite fit correctly without first clipping away part of the skull's rear. I cleaned this up a little bit to help it fit better against the belt, and once I had a snug fit, I glued it into place. I followed this up with a second skull next to it, before finishing off the belt with a scabbard taken from the regular Intercessor sprue. Chains featured heavily in the Astra Primursa's aesthetics. While I've touched on this with the chainmail loincloths, I thought that Coda's chest would benefit from some heavy-duty jewellery. I took a length of fine chain and superglued it to one side of the collar and left this to dry. I then pulled the chains across the collar and cut the chain at the point where it reached the other side. This end was then glued into place too. While the chain was fixed to the model, it could still move around a little, which would make painting it much harder. This would be resolved by adding some small amounts of glue along the chain's length, just enough to bond the links to each other and keep them in place. Finally, the fur collar was added to Coda in the exact same ways I tackled Sitka earlier. The final team member was Lorik, who I decided to build as the team sniper. Unfortunately, the heavy bolt rifle wasn't quite up to scratch for representing this specialization, so I grabbed myself a spare sniper rifle from the Eliminator's kit. With this, I first carefully cut away the suppressor / muzzle brake from the front of the rifle, using my knife to get a clean cut as close to the main stock of the rifle as possible. In addition to this, I also removed the strap that hung beneath the sniper rifle as well. From the heavy bolt rifle, I removed the smaller muzzle that protruded from the end of the gun, before making sure that those contact points had been trimmed flat. Attaching the suppressor to the bolt rifle with glue alone wouldn't have been sturdy enough, so I decided to pin it instead. This involved drilling a 1mm hole into both the suppressor and the bolt rifle at the points where I intended to join the components. Into the suppressor, I then glued some 1mm thick plastic rod before clipping the rod so that just a few millimeters were left protruding. This remaining rod was then glued into the hole in the bolt rifle, completing the join with a much sturdier bond. Then, after a little trimming and a gentle bend, the strap was glued beneath the rifle too. No sniper rifle is complete though without a scope. This particular piece was taken from the regular intercessors before it was cut away from the magazine. Using my knife, I then carefully removed a couple of the ridges from the mounting rail at the top of the heavy bolt rifle, making enough room to attach the new scope to. The sniper rifle was then completed by gluing the scope into place. The rifle could then be glued to Lorik's torso, which was followed by the shoulder pads and another Primursa head. I also added a couple of intercessor pouches to the chest as well, before finishing off the model with another fur collar. And with that, the team was completed. They just needed to be based and painted, which left me with these. And here we have the completed Astra Primursa kill team. Now that they have a suitable paint job and basing scheme to tie everything together, you can see just how that rugged and bulky theme comes across. A big part of this is the custom components. These help to create a consistent style across each member of the team, which meant that I could focus my other adjustments on making each of the intercessors distinct from each other. As I've already mentioned, the weapon loadouts aren't strictly legal if you subscribe to the what you see is what you get view of Warhammer, but considering how limited the new kill team rules have left the heavy intercessors, I think some artistic license is allowed here. Besides, because they can only really be equipped with bolt rifles and one heavy bolter, opponents shouldn't have much of a hard time playing against them. Now, if you're interested in how I painted and based these, or you just want to see more of the Astra Primursa, then go check out Tabletop Time's videos. I'll include a link to them above and in the description, along with the links to where you can pick up these custom components for yourself. But before I go, let me just say a huge thank you to my ever-generous Patreon supporters. Currently, my top supporters are Jonathan Hart, Ryan Little, Stuart Smith, Tim, Berserker, Daniel Dowling, Dakota the Destroyer, Jake, Jeremy Kaup, Jesse Smith, Casper Lundberg, Mr. Grimm, and Swedsman. So a big thank you to you guys, and if you also support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, then it is the kind-hearted people such as yourselves that allow me to fund the kits and tools required to build these conversions. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.